right, so get this. You're scrolling through your favorite app, and bam, a notification pops up saying your food delivery is right around the corner. Ever think about how that app knows exactly where your food is?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Well, we're going to unpack that secret sauce today, those behind-the-scenes messengers we call APIs. You sent in some seriously in-depth stuff on how to actually build them, and while the code might seem like, well, gibberish at first glance,
Yeah, a lot of people think that.
don't worry. That's what we're here for,
Kid.
to decode it all.
Exactly.
So think of APIs as the, I don't know, the invisible connectors that make our digital world work.
They're the reason your food app can actually talk to the restaurant, the driver's navigation, and your phone all at the same time.
It's like a secret network running everything, right?
Yeah.
So this how to build an API tutorial you send in, it really gets into the nitty-gritty. But before we get lost in the code, let's take a step back.
Yeah, good idea.
What are the big aha moments? The core concepts we need to understand first.
All right, well, at its core, an API, it stands for Application Programming Interface. It's essentially like a universal translator, for applications.
I like that.
It allows apps to speak different languages but still understand each other and share information.
So it's like they can communicate even though they speak different languages.
Exactly.
Cool. So one example from the tutorial is the REST architectural style. That sounds familiar. Can you unpack that a bit? What is REST and how does it work?
So REST, it stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's really the foundation for a lot of APIs we see today.
Okay.
Think about it like this. You have your food delivery app. It needs to pull information about your order from the restaurant system, right?
Right.
And then it needs to send updates to the driver's navigation app and then keep you updated on your phone, too.
Right.
And all these systems might be built on completely different technology.
I see.
REST acts like a common language, ensuring all those systems can seamlessly communicate and share data, in real time.
Gotcha. So REST is what makes sure that whole intricate dance of data happens without a hitch.
Pretty much, yeah. And because it's based on the same principles as the web, using familiar things like URLs, it's incredibly adaptable and can handle massive amounts of data.
That's super important, especially with how much data is flying around these days.
Right.
Okay, so let's get down to the nuts and bolts of building an API. The tutorial mentions picking the right tools, like programming languages. We're talking C#, Python, JavaScript.
Right. It can be a bit overwhelming.
It's like standing in front of a wall of tools and not knowing which one to pick up first, right?
Think of it like this. If you're building a bookshelf, you wouldn't use a hammer for every step, would you?
I guess not. So each language has its strengths,
Yeah.
like different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. It all depends on what you're trying to build.
So tell me about those different tools.
All right, well, C# with ASP.NET Core, it's mentioned in the source material, and it's really excellent for creating robust APIs, enterprise-level stuff where security and stability are super important.
Okay, so the heavy-duty tools for when you need something really solid.
Yeah. Python, especially with frameworks like Flask or FastAPI, is known for being super beginner-friendly and quick to get up and running.
Got it.
It's ideal for projects where speed and flexibility are key. Then we have JavaScript with Node.js and Express. It's a powerhouse for real-time applications, like chat apps or live dashboards, things like that.
So each language is like a specialized tool in our API building toolkit.
Exactly.
The tutorial also mentions IDEs, integrated development environments, and package managers.
Right.
Help me make sense of those.
All right, well, think of it like this. You're a chef. An IDE is your kitchen with all your tools and appliances laid out in front of you, ready to go.
A well-organized kitchen.
Right. It's a developer's workspace to streamline writing, testing, and all that fun stuff. And package managers are like your ingredient delivery service.
Oh, I like that.
Instead of, chopping every vegetable yourself, you can order pre-packaged ingredients. So package managers let you import pre-built code modules, like functions for handling dates or connecting to databases, that sort of thing.
Oh, that's super convenient. It's like having a whole library of pre-written code at your fingertips.
Yeah, exactly.
Now let's talk about the building blocks themselves. The source dives into creating an API endpoint. Sounds kind of technical.
It might sound complex, but it's surprisingly simple. Think of it like a specific door on a building.
Okay.
Each door leads to a different room or functionality. The tutorial uses a Flask example where a simple code snippet defines an endpoint that, when you access it, returns a hello world message.
So it's like the API's way of saying, hey, I'm here and ready to work.
Yeah, exactly. And this basic structure is like the foundation for more complex interactions. Instead of just a greeting, imagine endpoints for retrieving data, adding new information, or updating existing records. So many
Oh,
possibilities.
I see. So that hello world is just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, you got it.
Okay, so we've got our endpoint set up. Now, how do we actually tell the API what we want it to do?
That's where HTTP methods come in. They're like the verbs of API communication. They instruct the API on what action to perform.
The verb, so it's like the action words.
Yeah, exactly. And the tutorial talks about four common ones: get, post, potee, and delete.
Okay, can you break those down for me?
All right, imagine you're browsing an online store.
All right.
When you look at a product page, your browser's actually sending a GET request to the store's API. It's basically saying, hey, show me the details for this product.
Oh, that makes sense.
So GET-E is for retrieving information.
Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Now, what about if I want to add something new, like adding a product to my shopping cart?
Right, that would be a POST request.
Okay.
It's like submitting a form telling the API, hey, add this item to the cart with these specific details.
Gotcha. So get T for viewing, post for adding. What about updating information, like changing the quantity of an item? Right, that's where PUT comes in. It's like editing an existing document,
Okay.
saying, hey, update this specific item with this new quantity.
I see.
And then finally, delete. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's for removing something, like taking an item out of your cart.
Okay, so it's like hitting the delete key.
Exactly. And the tutorial actually shows a code snippet for creating an item using a POST request. It's cool to see how these ideas turn into actual code.
That's always the fun part, seeing it come to life. So we've got these four main methods to interact with an API.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about data integrity, making sure all the info flowing through our API is accurate and trustworthy.
Right, because we don't want any garbage data messing things up.
How do we make sure of that?
Data validation and error handling are crucial here. It's like having a bouncer at a club.
Okay, tell me more.
The bouncer's checking IDs, making sure everyone meets the requirements to get in, right? An API needs to do the same, validate incoming data to make sure it meets specific criteria.
I see, like making sure an email address is actually formatted correctly.
Exactly, or that a required field's actually filled out. And the tutorial shows a nice example using express.js. It demonstrates how an API can check for that required data and then give you an error message if something's missing.
Right, you don't want it to just accept anything.
No, definitely not. Speaking of data, where does it all get stored?
That's where databases come in. They're like massive, well-organized warehouses where all the information lives.
Got it. So how do APIs talk to these databases?
Well, a lot of the time we use something called an ORM. It stands for Object Relational Mapper.
ORM.
Yeah, imagine you have a translator who can flawlessly switch between, say, English and Japanese.
Okay.
ORMs are like that. They convert the API's code into something the database understands.
So they're the bridge between the API world and the database world. Exactly. The tutorial uses Squalchemy, which is a popular ORM for Python. It shows how to define the structure for storing items in the database, like giving each entry an ID and a name. It's like setting up labeled shelves in our warehouse.
It's all about organization.
Right.
But we can't just let anyone have access to that warehouse, right?
Okay.
Security's got to be a big deal.
Absolutely. We wouldn't want just anyone walking in and taking whatever they want. We need to control who has access and what they can do.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we secure an API?
That's where authentication and authorization come in. They're like our API's security guards, making sure only the right people get in.
Okay, break that down for me.
All right, think of it like a bank vault.
Okay.
It has multiple layers of security, right? First, you have to prove who you are, maybe with a key card or fingerprint scan.
Right.
That's authentication, verifying your identity. And then, depending on your clearance level, you might only be allowed into certain sections of the vault.
Okay.
That's authorization, controlling what you can access.
So authentication checks who you are, and authorization says what you're allowed to do.
Exactly. And for APIs, we use things like API keys, which are like secret passwords, or JWTs, which are like more advanced digital tokens that store info about the user. The tutorial shows how to use Flask JWT Extended to add authentication to an endpoint.
So it's like adding that extra layer of security, making sure only the right users get through.
Yeah, that's the idea. We've covered a lot of ground so far, from what an API is to the different languages you can use to build them, to diving into endpoints, HTTP methods, and even security. Building an API is a multifaceted process, absolutely.
All right, so we've built this awesome API, but before we release it into the wild, how do we know if it's really ready?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
We'll talk all about testing and deploying our API, but first, let's pause here for a second and let all this info sink in.
Sounds good to me. Take a break, grab a snack, and we'll be back in a flash to continue our API journey.
All right, see you in a bit.
Okay, so we're back, ready to dive into the next part of our API adventure. We've built this fantastic API, but before we set it loose, got to make sure it's, ready for the big leagues.
Exactly. Got to make sure everything works as expected.
So testing, right?
Exactly.
That's where we figure out if it's actually ready for prime time.
It's kind of like, building a car but not taking it for a test drive first.
Oh yeah, that wouldn't be a good idea.
No, not at all. You'd want to make sure the engine runs smooth, brakes work, no weird noises.
So testing an API, that's kind of the same idea.
Pretty much, yeah. We want to make sure everything runs smoothly and there are no surprises.
Got it. So how do we actually test an API?
Well, luckily, there are some fantastic tools out there that make it pretty easy. Things like Postman and Curl.
Okay, I've heard of Postman.
Yeah, it's like a virtual dashboard where you can send different types of requests to your API and see what you get back.
Yeah.
It's like having a conversation with your API, asking questions and seeing how it responds. The tutorial actually shows a curl command, sending a test request to that hello world endpoint we talked about earlier. It's just a quick check to make sure the API is, alive and well.
Yeah, like a little ping to say, hey, are you there?
Exactly. And then beyond those manual checks, we can also set up automated tests.
Oh, interesting.
Think of them like little robot assistants that are constantly checking the API for any problems. They're super helpful, especially when you're making changes to the code, to make sure you didn't accidentally break anything.
Automated tests sound like a real time saver.
They definitely are, especially for larger APIs.
All right, so we've built our API, we've tested it, made sure everything works. Now it's time for the grand unveiling, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we actually deploy an API? How do we make it accessible to the world?
Deploying an API, it's like, opening the doors to our data warehouse, making it available for others to use.
Okay, I like that analogy.
And there are a few ways to do this. Cloud platforms like AWS, Azure, and GCP, they're like renting space in these huge data centers. They handle all the infrastructure stuff, so we can just focus on the API itself.
So it's like having a team of experts manage the building while we work on the product inside.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Another option is using Docker.
Docker.
Yeah, you can think of it like packing up our API and everything it needs into a neat little container, a container that can run anywhere.
Well,
It's like having a portable data center in a box. And the tutorial actually includes a Docker file, which is like the instructions for building that container image. Once you have the image, you can deploy it pretty much anywhere.
Docker sounds pretty powerful.
It is. It makes deploying so much easier.
Okay, so before we wrap up, let's talk best practices. What are some things we should keep in mind when we're building and deploying APIs to make sure they're reliable, secure, and easy to maintain? What are the pro tips?
Right, because just getting it to work isn't enough. We want to make sure we're building it well. One important thing is versioning.
Okay.
Think about software updates on your phone. You don't want a new update to completely break your favorite app.
Oh, yeah, that's the worst.
So versioning is like creating different editions of our API as we make changes. It helps ensure that older applications that rely on our API don't suddenly stop working.
So it's all about backwards compatibility, making sure things transition smoothly.
Yeah, pretty much. And another crucial one is rate limiting.
Rate limiting. Okay, tell me more about that.
It's like imagine a popular nightclub.
Okay.
They can't just let everyone in at once, right?
It'd be total chaos.
Exactly. Rate limiting is kind of like that. It controls how many requests can hit our API at a time so we don't overload the system.
So it's about making sure things run smoothly and preventing any abuse.
Exactly. And the tutorial you sent in actually recommends some excellent resources if you want to go even deeper into API development.
Oh, yeah, those resources are going to be super helpful for our listeners who are ready to build their own APIs.
Definitely. It's been really cool to break down the world of APIs today, seeing those hidden connections that power so much of our digital lives.
Yeah, it really is fascinating stuff. And to our listeners, I encourage you to check out those resources and keep exploring. But before we wrap up entirely, I want to leave you with a little challenge, something to think about. How could you use APIs, to solve an everyday problem or even come up with something totally new? Think about those apps you use all the time and all that data. Imagine if you could connect things in a new way. What would you build?
That's a really cool challenge. APIs are so versatile. With a little imagination, you can build some pretty amazing stuff.
I did.
Think about it, an app that connects to a weather API and your calendar
Yeah.
to recommend the perfect time to go for a run,
Oh, that'd be awesome.
or maybe a service that links up all your different social media accounts so you can manage them from one place.
You know, it's pretty mind-blowing when you start thinking about the possibilities.
Yeah,
It's like APIs are digital building blocks. Once you understand how to connect them, you can build almost anything.
and it's not just about building new things either. You can also use APIs to improve existing processes, make things more efficient and user-friendly.
Oh, right, like a business using APIs to automate things like inventory or customer support.
Exactly. Saves time and resources.
The possibilities really are endless. The big takeaway here is don't be afraid to experiment. Whether you're a coding pro or just starting out, there's always something new to discover in the API world.
Absolutely. And even if you're not a coder, just understanding how APIs work can give you a whole new appreciation for how the digital world functions.
Totally. It's like taking a peek behind the curtain and seeing how everything's connected.
Exactly.
So to wrap up our deep dive into the world of APIs, I want to leave you with this. Next time you're scrolling through an app or browsing a website, think about those APIs working quietly in the background, connecting everything, making it all work.
The unsung heroes of the digital age.
They really are. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world of knowledge.